President, thank you. And I'm here to come to the floor to talk about one of the favorite things I get to do all week, and that's talk about some Alaskans who are making a difference, what we call our Alaskan of the Week. And it means that I get to speak about my state, usually an individual, maybe a couple people, but every now and then, Mr. President, I like to mix things up. Keep people on high alert because the people I'm going to talk about in Alaska are the ultimate people, Americans on high alert. So as opposed to recognizing one or two, I'm going to recognize a bunch of Alaskans, an impressive group who work day and night, not only to keep Alaska safe, but to keep America safe. And they'll be doing it this weekend, 4th of July, 24/7, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, always on high alert. Mr. President, as we're heading into the 4th of July weekend, and Russia is once again in the news, and we've been debating the National Defense Authorization Act here on the Senate floor, very critical bill that I'm fully supportive of, that funds our military, pay raises for our troops. I thought it would be very appropriate to highlight the hundreds of men and women in my state who stand watch and patrol the northern skies of Alaska and America to protect our nation. They're unsung heroes. You don't hear a lot about them in the news, but we certainly appreciate them, and I think all senators and all Americans do, which is why I wanted to talk about them today. These brave service members who fly and maintain our F-22 Raptors, this amazing stealth fighter, our E-3 Sentries, which are also known as AWACS, which are like the quarterback in the sky with aircraft, our Alaska Guard KC-135 Stratotankers, our brave members of the Alaska Rescue Coordination Center who operate HH-60 Pavehawk helicopters and H-130 Hercules aircraft, should we need a search and rescue mission, and our active duty members and guardsmen who maintain, monitor, and track threats from other countries, for our country, particularly threats coming from Russia. These brave men and women, Mr. President, hundreds of them, are keeping guard day and night over the northern skies of America. And when the Russians fly their Bear bombers and fighter jets into or near American airspace, these intrepid Americans are on duty to ensure that our F-22s are there to intercept and greet the Russian pilots and their aircraft who threaten to move into our air defense identification zone, ADIZ as we call it. So they're there. They are there, waiting, intercepting Russian bombers. These airmen keep us all safe. And as I mentioned, Mr. President, they are all worthy of the great title, Alaskans of the Week. Now, Mr. President, before I get into exactly what these men and women do to guard our nation, and they do it round the clock, doing it right now, by the way. They're going to be doing it on the 4th of July, by the way. I'd like to talk a little bit about Russia and Alaska and our close geography. A little geography lesson. There are actual places in Alaska where you really can't see Russia from your house. Russia and Alaska are divided by the Bering Strait, which is about 55 miles at its narrowest point. In the middle of the Bering Strait sit two islands, Big Diomede, which is actually Russian territory, and Little Diomede, which is part of Alaska, part of America. They are less than 2.5 miles apart from each other, nearly touching. In the words of a New York Times reporter, it's the place where, quote, the two great continental powers reach across the map and all but touch, like the outstretched figures in Michelangelo's The Creation of Adam, unquote. Little dramatic, but you get the point. Right there, little Diomede, big Diomede. On a clear day, you can see Russia from St. Lawrence Island, also Alaska, and even from our mainland in Wales, Alaska. Now, during the Cold War, Mr. President, the Alaska-Siberia frontier was called not the Iron Curtain, but the Ice Curtain, which we needed to stay closed. Much preparation was put into keeping Russia from invading or infiltrating the United States from its northern flank, from the Arctic, from Alaska. In the early Cold War years, our government recruited and trained fishermen, bush pilots, trappers, and many, many in our patriotic Alaska Native communities throughout the state to stand guard for America during the Cold War. And so many Alaskans did this for decades, patriotic duty, guarding the northern flank of our great nation. There were the great Eskimo Scouts of the Alaskan National Guard who knew the land better than anyone else could and so patriotic for their love of this nation. It's still unclear how many Russians were able to get to our lands, but stories do abound. Stories abound in Alaska. Strangers speaking Russian showing up in communities unannounced. 5 men emerging from the water in wetsuits over olive-drab uniforms, the color of the uniform of Soviet Special Forces. Go to one of our many Alaska Native communities, and today you'll still hear such stories. But something that is very clear and very well known is that between 1961, the United States military intercepted thousands of long-range Soviet bombers and reconnaissance aircraft when they were moving into American airspace. We used our aircraft back then, the F-102s, F-106s, later the F-4s, F-15s. Then, like now, our aircraft were superior to the Russians, and that was certainly one of the reasons we won the Cold War. But, Mr. President, this is still going on today. Still a threat. The Russians continue to flex their military muscle from Ukraine to Siberia and have added some new blackjack bombers to the mix and their Su-35 fighters. And they still come close to American airspace via flights near Alaska. And that's where our F-22s and those who support them come in. Just in the last 6 months, our Alaskan F-22s, shown here, Mr. President, have intercepted 10 Russian Bear bombers. So we are starting to see Cold War levels of intrusions into American airspace, and of course, our patriotic men and women, young men and women, by the way, flying these great aircraft, going after these big Bear bombers. 10 missions already, and it's just July 2nd. So what are they up to? Air Force General Terrence O'Shaughnessy, who commands NORAD, and these forces ultimately, and U.S. Northern Command, linked the pickup in the uptick in Russian military flights off Alaska's coast to the ongoing coronavirus pandemic and Russia's testing of our military readiness. They're testing us, Mr. President, but we are ready for them. In essence, that's what we've been doing all week, debating, getting ready to vote on for final passage the National Defense Authorization, which is all about our military's readiness. And again, in Alaska, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, our brave men and women are guarding the northern flank of America. This is how Lieutenant Colonel Dave Deptula, commander of the 425th Fighter Squadron, this F-22 squadron, the Bulldogs, describes it. Quote, "The Russians will fly their bombers and fighters across the Bering Strait, and they will test our ADIZ, our airspace. They will try to see if they can come into American airspace. And if they were going to get into it, we are going to, every time, before they get there, respectfully say, 'Hello, we're here, and we're flying with live ammunition.'" He said the goal is to make sure that the Russians know they are there to protect our nation and try to de-escalate. By the way, Colonel Deptula is a former Air Force fellow in my office and a great Air Force leader just like his dad. As an aside, pilots in the military have what are called call signs, which are essentially their pilot nicknames. As a Marine, I know many pilots by their call signs. Lieutenant Colonel Deptula's call sign is Ghost. Now maybe that's because he's a F-22 stealth fighter pilot, able to sneak up on Bear bombers like this without being seen and even heard. But I've also heard maybe it's because when it's time to pay the tab at the bar, he doesn't seem to be around. That's just kidding there, Colonel Deptula, Ghost. I can't think of a better call sign for an F-22 stealth fighter pilot in Alaska, and we are very, very proud of Ghost in the Sullivan Senate office. So, Mr. President, here's how it works. Here's what these brave young men and women in the U.S. Air Force do to protect our nation. We have 15 long-range radar sites across the great state of Alaska, constantly feeding information to the 176th Air Defense Squadron, who analyze that information. By the way, I have the honor and pleasure next week of hosting the Secretary of the Air Force in Alaska, and she will be able to see our great military members, and we will go out and actually see some of these radar sites. When our military notice troublesome activity, they send out a bone-rattling alarm, what's called the klaxon, to the Combat Alert Cell. This is a group of pilots and maintainers who are always ready. They're like firemen. They literally have a pole where they come down, scramble to get to their aircraft, what they call a hot-cocked armed F-22 at the ready. As these pilots literally race to their jets, so too does the air crew of the AWACS, the long-range eyes and ears for the F-22s. And they launch very quickly. Simultaneously, this is taking place at JBER in Anchorage. At Eielson Air Force Base, about 350 miles north of Anchorage, the 168th Air Refueling Squadron, a unit of the Alaska National Guard, launches the KC-135 tankers to meet the F-22s as they're going to intercept the Russians, to be able to top off the 600-gallon F-22 fuel tanks when they're in the air, and then refuel them on the way back. All part of one big mission. That's what they're doing. All told, Mr. President, there are hundreds of Alaskans in the air, on the ground, involved in operations like this every single time it happens. And as I mentioned, it's happening a lot, twice a month in the last half year. Patriotic young men and women, always prepared to defend our country in the sky, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So one thing I want to do for this Alaskan of the Week, Mr. President, is remind Americans when they're celebrating the 4th of July, which is a great thing to do. Remember, these dedicated warriors will be on guard, protecting our nation. When everybody's barbecuing, celebrating America, think about what they're doing. If you've seen any video of the F-22s flying, it's impressive. But we also have to remember that there are real pilots in those planes. And this mission, look how close they are, can be very dangerous. Think of this. Just give a sense of how this all works. It's the middle of the night. The klaxon goes off. It's winter in Alaska, dark, 20 below zero. A pilot hustles to her airplane. Yes, her. We have F-22 female pilots. One, call sign Contra, who we were just discussing what a great job she does in my office recently. She gets in the aircraft, flies nearly 600 miles, sometimes certainly faster than the speed of sound, to reach the rough Bering Sea to intercept a Russian Bear bomber like this in the middle of the night. Probably had to refuel on the way there. Sometimes Russian pilots can get aggressive. According to ghosts, we do not respond aggressively in turn. We are respectful. We are tough. We are professional. The Russians know it, and the Russians know that they're up against the best Air Force in the world, armed and ready, and so the Russians usually behave. But this can be a stressful mission, and as I mentioned, it's happened 10 times already in the last 6 months. But it's so critical for our nation. So many young Alaskans are involved in this. Mr. President, our men and women in the military represent the very best of this country. Brave, strong, committed, devoted to our country, devoted to democracy, devoted to the republic. That's why what we've been doing all week, and when we come back from our 4th of July work period, we'll be continuing to work on and pass the National Defense Authorization Act for them. And on this 4th of July holiday, as I mentioned, I hope we can take the time to thank them and to remember those who have served before, knowing that when you're spending time with friends and family this holiday, dozens of airmen in Alaska are on alert and ready to go do this mission in a moment's notice. We have to remember also, Mr. President, that the freedoms we are celebrating this weekend have been secured at a price. There is no Independence Day without the U.S. military and our courageous veterans past and present. And it's not just about protecting our nation. Think about this, Mr. President. American service members have done more to liberate men and women across the globe from tyranny and oppression, hundreds of millions of people, literally, probably more than any other force in human history. And that includes those who are currently serving. Think about that when you're celebrating 4th of July. Can any other country say that? Think about the other big countries in the world. China, Russia, Germany. Have they been forces to liberate hundreds of millions? The fact is, those are the kind of countries who have tried to dominate hundreds of millions. And as my friend from Arkansas just mentioned, China is doing it again in Hong Kong as we speak. So yes, our nation has challenges right now. No doubt about it. But I think the vast majority of us recognize the obvious fact. We are the greatest country in the world and have stood for liberating not just Americans, but hundreds of millions around the world. My view is we're the greatest country in the history of the world. And one reason is because of those who stand guard to protect us and our freedoms and our liberty. So a big thank you to those who fly and maintain our F-22 Raptors, our AWACS, our Alaska National Guard KC-135s, our HH-60s, our H-130s, all the active duty members and guardsmen who on the 4th of July that we're going to celebrate in a couple days will be ready to go do this mission on a moment's notice and ready to protect us. I'll be up on the Yukon River in Alaska with my wife and daughters, as we always do, to celebrate not only America's birthday, but my wife's. But, Mr. President, we will be toasting the brave young men and women who are doing this for our country. And I want to encourage the rest of my fellow Americans to do the same. And to the Raptor pilots and maintainers and everybody who support them, thanks for what you're doing. And most importantly, congratulations on being our Alaskans of the Week. I yield the floor.